Okay, hi everyone. You're very welcome to today's discussion with Professor Peter Burke at Trinity College Dublin. My name is Donna Lyons. I'm with the School of Law, and this is seminar 13 in our speaker series. The School of Law is really happy to be co-hosting this event with the History Department tonight, the History Department in Trinity College, and with Dr. Patrick Houlihan in particular, who's Assistant Professor and Director of the MPhil Programme in International History. So he's here with us today. Let me just, sorry, 1 second. So Professor Peter Burke was educated in London and Oxford. He was one of the first junior lecturers to be appointed at the University of Sussex, attracted by the interdisciplinary programme, and remained there for 17 years. He moved to Cambridge in 1979, where he became Professor of Cultural History. He retired from the chair in 2004, but remains a life fellow of Emmanuel College. So we're very privileged to be speaking to you today, Professor Burke. You've published hundreds of articles and chapters, as well as 30 books, from Culture and Society in Renaissance Italy to A Social History of Knowledge and Exiles and Expatriates in the History of Knowledge. And your work has been translated into 33 languages. For most of his career, Peter worked on the cultural and social history of early modern Europe, but now extends his investigations more widely to include Brazil and the 20th century. And he's currently working on a book relating to the social history of ignorance. We're very much looking forward to that. I think the last time you spoke in Trinity was in the 1970s, you were telling me, Professor Burke, so we're really delighted to welcome you back. And today we're talking about your most recent publication, the Polymath. So the Polymath, a cultural history from Leonardo da Vinci to Susan Sontag. And you say in this book that polymaths have moved the frontiers of knowledge in countless ways, and history can be unkind to scholars with such encyclopedic interests. You say in the book that all too often these individuals are remembered for just one part of their valuable achievements. But in this book, you argue for a more rounded view, and I'm looking forward to discussing that. So by identifying 500 Western polymaths, you explore their wide-ranging successes and show how their rise matched a rapid growth of knowledge in the age of the invention of printing, the discovery of the New World, and the scientific revolution. And it's only more recently that the further acceleration of knowledge has led to an increased specialization in modern society and to an environment that's less supportive of wide-ranging scholars and scientists. And I think that's very pertinent to us in the university environment as well as broader society. So to begin, Professor Burke, thank you for being here. And you say on page 1 that history has been unkind to polymaths. I'm wondering, before we start, if you could tell us what is a polymath in your view?
So first, thank you, Donna, for the generous introduction, and good evening, everybody, wherever you are. Now, so when I decided to write this book, of course, I had to face the problem of definition. And I chose a relatively conventional one, which is a polymath is somebody who has mastered a number of, some people would say many intellectual disciplines. That's what the original meaning of the term was in ancient Greek. Only after I began work on the book, I realized that there's another definition of polymath, much more recent and much more ample, according to which a polymath is anyone that is many-sided. It doesn't matter what kind of side. You can be a singer, an athlete, a politician, businessman, whatever it is. And indeed, when I used to give a lecture on polymaths, is because I like to give lectures before I write a book, because the feedback from audiences gives me some sense of what the readers are wanting or expecting. But I used to talk about a possible decline of the polymath at the end of the 20th century. And then I would say, I can't think of any polymath who was born after about 1960. And if anybody in the audience thinks of an exception, would they let me know? Interestingly, 2 people said Elon Musk. And it's true, he has very different sides. I think he was a mathematician and a computer scientist once, but now it's business. So, and I wasn't counting at being active in a business as opposed to analyzing business studies. And so according to my criteria, then I wouldn't include. And I'm relieved in a way that I chose the narrower definition, because if you're writing about 500 years of history, and if you're geographically concerned not only with Europe, about the Americas, Australia, and well, if you don't limit the enterprise in another way, it's like writing about everything. And so much then for definitions.
Thank you so much. It's a great place to start. And as you go through the book, you work chronologically from the Renaissance up to the present day in terms of your exploration of what a polymath is. So maybe just looking at your exploration in chapter 2 of the Renaissance man between 1400 and 1600, how did polymaths present during that period?
So I have to confess here that right in that first chapter, I was breaking my own rules, because if you're going to write about the Renaissance and about knowledge in the Renaissance, the question of the so-called Renaissance man, and indeed also Renaissance woman, inevitably comes up. But then it turns out that the Renaissance man, or as they said at the time, the universal man, doesn't quite fit my model, because the typical Renaissance man was a gentleman who was equally skilled, they would say, in arms and letters. That is, very good horsemanship, swordsmanship on one side, and then on the other, a gift for writing poetry and a good knowledge of ancient Greek and Roman literature, philosophy, and history. So that's not quite what I was going to talk about for the rest of the book. And then there's the question of the biggest polymath of all in the period, Leonardo. He doesn't fit that Renaissance man model either. He doesn't fit any model really, because to begin with, he never went to university. He may not even have been to school, but he innovates in what academics call their disciplines, optics, botany, and engineering, and so on, not just in the visual arts. So in the visual arts, you can see that he was experimenting and gaining knowledge there too. So that makes that chapter slightly odd in relation to the other ones. But I don't think it would have been possible to write about the history of polymaths and leave the Renaissance out.
That makes total sense. Thank you. And then in the later chapters, you talk about the age of monsters of erudition between 1600 and 1700, and then the age of the man of letters between 1700 and 1850, and then the age of territoriality between 1850 and 2000. Would you like to walk us through how the definitions changed through those periods and how polymaths presented during that time?
Fine, so let me start with the 17th century, and because I think of it as a kind of golden age of polymaths. That is, of course, in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, there were scholars who knew a lot about a lot of different things. There's a sense in which it was almost the default setting, because there weren't so many disciplines. In a university at the end of the Middle Ages, there were only 10 disciplines normally, the 7 liberal arts for the undergraduates, and then the 3 forms of professional training, theology, law, and medicine. Well, it was difficult, but it's far from impossible to master all these subjects if you're Thomas Aquinas or somebody like that. And even for lesser people, they wouldn't necessarily. I think it was the exception, not the rule, to confine your activity to just one discipline. But the 17th century is more of a challenge because of the way in which so much new information, new knowledge is coming in. It already started with the Renaissance because of the exploration of other countries. So that's knowledge about the natural history and the history of all these places. And then there's the two inventions that were a great help to research, the telescope and the microscope, and they opened up new worlds of knowledge. So I think of the 17th century as a kind of point of equilibrium. So it's still possible to not only to study the different subjects, you can actually make a contribution, you can innovate in more than one subject. With all that new information coming in, this is the challenge to scholars at the time. It's difficult to do, but a few extraordinary people really could master more disciplines than I can think of and recite to you. The one I admire most is Leibniz, but there were other monsters of erudition. This is the wonderful phrase of a Dutch scholar of the 17th century talking with admiration about some of his contemporaries. Because already in the 18th century, it's getting more and more difficult to do this kind of thing. It's interesting, Denis Diderot, who edited the Encyclopédie, and in fact he wrote articles on quite a range of subjects. Though he didn't innovate in them, he mastered them in the sense of knowing about them. But he's already expressing an awareness of increasing specialization, especially in medicine. Medicine, I suppose, lends itself to specialization because you can choose a part of the body or you can choose an illness, and that makes it possible to help people more because you know more about that particular speciality. Interesting. When the word specialist in English had a medical context before it had any other kind of context. So, and there were just the first signs in the 18th century of the crack between what C.P. Snow called the two cultures, the culture of the arts, humanities on one side, and of the physical sciences on the other. It's just a crack because you take the people who most famous in the world of the arts and humanities. Take Voltaire. He carried out experiments in his spare time, and he was really interested in keeping up with the natural sciences. Didn't contribute anything. They weren't new experiments, but he, like lots of other people in the 18th century, he took pleasure in repeating famous experiments, not just reading about them, but actually mixing things in a tube and so on. And on the other side, the scientists like, say, Buffon, who was so important in natural history. But he was an educated man in the normal 18th century French style. He could talk to you about literature, about the classics, about art. And only in the 19th century, the age of territoriality, that crack becomes a split, and in the 20th century it would become a gulf. And I think institutional change is part of the story. It's part of the story is there's more and more knowledge, and therefore nobody can really master all of it. And so you break off a manageable fragment and study that. But it's also institutionalized in the reform of universities. They multiply the number of faculties. And so new disciplines are breaking off rather than they're not invented ex nihilo. For example, where does psychology come from? Well, it came from faculties of philosophy, and then particular part of philosophy. People pursuing it, they thought, actually, this ought to be an autonomous subject, and then I can be a professor of it. So there is an atmosphere of competition and people trying to make a reputation as the first in a field for which you have then to construct the field. And it's good in the sense it enables people to cope with the increasing amount of information. But there are other reasons for it as well. And the downside is that sense of territoriality, which is what I wanted to refer to in the title, that you construct your field and then you get very annoyed if other people try to trespass in it, if they're not in your own department or discipline. I remember even experiencing this sometimes when I was reading a book on a subject that wasn't history. There was a very funny occasion. I got a book out of the library by Malinowski, and I was walking along the path and bumped into the professor of anthropology, who looked at the book in my hand and he just said, "Oh, we anthropologists don't believe in that stuff anymore." Of course, it was partly true. He had himself led a kind of revolution against Malinowski's functionalism. But I think I was right in interpreting what he said as a polite way of saying, what are you doing in my field? Or even keep out. So much then for territoriality.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think you mentioned in the book your use of terminology with geographical terminology, territoriality, and fields referring to disciplines, and that's quite appropriate because there's that sense of trespass across rather than open sharing of knowledge. There are boundaries between the sectors or the fields of knowledge. And I'm really glad you mentioned C.P. Snow, because that was something that Patrick actually was saying to me beforehand. I think he'll be really glad that you touched on that because it's one of his interests. But coming on to just a broader portrait of polymaths before we talk about interdisciplinarity, which will connect up very nicely with the discussion on territoriality. But before we go into that, so I'm just curious about your discussion in chapter 6 around the characteristics of polymaths as a group. I know it's something you touched on already earlier on, but is that something you'd like to explore before we discuss interdisciplinarity?
Yes, I must admit that chapter 6 was the one that was most fun to write. I enjoyed writing the whole book, but this one in particular, the attempt to paint a group portrait of these really rather extraordinary individuals and what they had in common and what made them different from other scholars or other people. And one of the first things that impressed me was imagination. I didn't know this until I started reading biographies of one polymath after another, but quite a high proportion in the natural sciences as well as in the humanities and social sciences. Despite all the effort of mastering different disciplines, they found time to write poetry and found time to write novels. And I thought, then I asked myself whether could this have anything to do with their achievement as polymaths? And I wondered if they had exceptionally powerful imaginations, and if that was what helped them see analogies between problems and solutions in different fields, because that's one of the ways in which polymaths have made their biggest contribution, noting these analogies, and they pursue an approach which is normal in one field, but they pursue it in a different one where nobody's heard of it before. Actually, from that point of view, I was impressed by having a colleague at Sussex who was the professor of biology, a most remarkable man in all sorts of ways. And we would have conversations at lunch in the 60s and 70s on a wide range of subjects. He was called John Maynard Smith. Very interesting man in all sorts of ways. But anyway, one day, I remember him saying that if he'd achieved anything in biology, and he may well have been the foremost British biologist at this point, he said, it's because I didn't read biology at university. What he'd done was study engineering at Cambridge. Then he decided he'd move into biology. This is what I call being a serial polymath, that you move from one discipline into another. And he wrote a doctoral dissertation, and it was about the evolution of the flight of birds. But he looked at that, or more exactly, from pterodactyls to birds, what's the evolution of their flying. And he looked at it with the eyes of an aeronautical engineer. And that meant he was interested in the balance, maybe one should say the trade-off between the need to be stable and the need to be able to maneuver. And it seems that in biology, people hadn't been asking those questions, and therefore that was a very exciting approach. I should have thought when he told me this, that I should have quoted Leonardo, because I remember now in the notebooks, Leonardo, who tried to construct a flying machine, but he wrote in the notebook, a bird is an instrument that operates according to mathematical law. If he hadn't known it already, John would have loved to have heard that. So that's one thing, but there are all sorts of other features of the group of polymaths. I hadn't really thought much about it before, but reading one biography after another, you start to see a sort of pattern. So polymaths are workaholics. That's one of the downsides for them, if not for the people who read their work. But they do find it very easy to absorb new information, which they do sometimes at incredible speed. People who watch them reading a book, and they've got very good memories, better than average. So the fact that they're reading very fast, or sometimes doing something else, walking down the street, reading the newspaper, and so on. And then they've got a great power of concentration on their problems, which is often perceived negatively by the people around them, because if you are watching the polymath, you just think, oh, that's a very absent-minded person. And there are lots of stories, even quite reliable stories, that come from their families about absent-mindedness. You know, Adam Smith went for a walk 15 miles and he was wearing his dressing gown. He obviously hadn't realized that when he left the house. And Henri Poincaré came back from a walk in Paris holding a bird cage. And when his wife said, "Why are you holding this?" he hadn't realized he'd picked up a bird cage. He didn't know where it was or why it was, because he was trying to solve a mathematical problem as he was walking. He was oblivious to everything else. You can see then that made this chapter a particularly enjoyable one to write.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. So moving from the discussion of the polymath and characteristics of polymaths as a group to the age of interdisciplinarity. So in chapter 8, you discuss the age of interdisciplinarity, so moving away from the age of territoriality. I'm wondering, how do you think the age of interdisciplinarity benefited or disadvantaged polymaths as a species? And what were the benefits or disadvantages for society more broadly? And where are we at now in relation to the interdisciplinarity?
Yes, I think interdisciplinarity is what polymaths did all the time, but it just wasn't called that. I think, as far as I know, the term only comes into regular use in the middle of the 20th century. And so it marks a conscious reaction against what's perceived as over-specialization. I think people who believe in interdisciplinarity, including myself, that we're not enemies of specialization. We think specialization is necessary, but there has to be some way of compensating for it, because the specialists achieve because they narrow themselves, but they don't want to be narrow the whole time. And anyway, if you have very sharply defined disciplines, there's a problem that sometimes interesting problems fall down into the gap between them. So you've got, you need somebody that's interested in several disciplines at once to attack that kind of border problem. So what's special about interdisciplinarity as a movement is that it changes institutions. And so the idea is that we have to encourage polymaths. And how can we do it? So one solution is at the level of undergraduates at the university, that you don't teach them too narrow a subject. And that was the point of the University of Sussex when it was founded in 1961. And the ambition was to redraw the map of learning, and the way to do it was all the students had a major subject, but they could only spend half their time on the major subject. But unlike the American system, where outside your major you could do anything you wanted, the Sussex idea was not to dissipate people's energies too much. They would be choosing, if they were studying history, they should be choosing to study a bit of certain disciplines which are not too far away from history. Might be philosophy, might be literature. Or if they were particularly interested in African history, then maybe anthropology. Or if they were interested in economic history, then economics. So it was a kind of carefully managed widening that wouldn't be too much for a bright 18-year-old who's got 3 years in university. So at that level, it was tried by a lot of places after Sussex. And Sussex has now abandoned it, I'm sorry to say. But I think that's more for practical reasons. That is, they didn't get enough students anymore. And in the climate of students wondering about whether they can get a job afterwards, it's understandable that they want to play safe. And playing safe might be to show that you know about one thing rather than to know less about more things. Anyway, but then there's another approach altogether, which is at the level of people who are studying or teaching and doing research in universities. And it's the invention of institutes of advanced study. Princeton in the 1930s, and then again imitated in so many different countries. And that's I'm totally in favor of this. I've been at several places of this kind and learned such a lot. So you're invited for a year to do your own research, but people in other disciplines are invited at the same time. And there's the hope that over a cup of coffee, people start to talk to one another and say what they're working on, and sometimes that connects in some way with what somebody else is doing. Or even as the Dutch have often done at their Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study, you invite a whole team to focus on a particular problem, but from the point of view of different disciplines. So when I was there, I think that was about 2005, there was a team of mainly Dutch scholars who were working on Hugo Grotius, who wasn't, in fact, a polymath. He's remembered as an international lawyer, but he was lots of other things. He wrote about philosophy, wrote about theology, wrote a very good history of the Netherlands. In his spare time, he wrote poetry, but people tend to forget this because it's all in Latin, and therefore fewer and fewer people can read it. And so there were lawyers, there were historians, there were philologists. So there are different ways in which you can organize these institutes or centers or well, whatever. And I think of them as a support for polymaths rather than a threat to polymaths.
Yeah. That's
What
great.
else did I? Yes, I should say I can think of one well-known late 20th century polymath who didn't really approve of any of this, and that was Herbert Simon. He was the man who got the Nobel Prize for economics when he'd never studied economics formally, never taught it, never worked in an economics department, and he just said, best interdisciplinarity is just in the head of one individual, which is okay if that individual is Herbert Simon, but I'm not sure. I think the rest of us need a bit more help, which includes institutional help. And so in that way, I remain in favor of what used to be so fashionable and is now maybe unfashionable, the Interdisciplinary Institute.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I was fortunate actually to have a desk in one of our institutes in Trinity called the Trinity Long Room Hub while I was doing my PhD, and I was actually sitting beside a historian doing a PhD in history for over a year, and that's exactly what they attempted to do, and it's something that they succeed at. So it's wonderful to hear about the history of the development of those centres and institutes, and also just to hear your view on the distinction between centres of interdisciplinarity and then having all of these talents and skills and knowledge in one person, and whether those things should be mutually exclusive or whether these centres can actually support the polymath. As you say, I think that's what you're saying, that they can benefit a polymath rather than being a threat. So that's interesting. So I have a question from Dr. Houlihan, who's our co-host. So I'm just going to promote Patrick to panelists, but I'll ask the question for purposes of ease. So hi, Patrick. So one of Patrick's questions was, how do you characterize the contemporary moment that we're in now? Is it a dark age, a renaissance, or some other paradigm? So 2000 years from now, for example, when archaeologists dig up our civilization, how will historians characterize the present era? I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that. It's a complicated question.
Yes, before I give a straight answer to this question, if I can, I want to comment on ages. I don't really believe anymore in concepts of dark ages or ages of light. I think the ages of light, such as the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, they have a dark side as well. And I think the so-called Dark Age, especially early medieval Europe, which from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment was often called an age of darkness. Well, it wasn't completely dark either. It had its light side. If I were having this conversation with you face to face in Trinity, I would just say everybody in the audience is sitting only a few yards away from the Book of Kells, and it's hard to say that object was produced in an age of darkness. And now coming on to the question about now, and of course it's rather difficult to characterize an age when it's only been going for 20 or 30 years. With other ages in the past, we're far enough away to look at long-term trends. But as you, I'm sure, can predict by now, I want to say that it's the digital age is neither just a new Renaissance, nor is it a new Dark Ages, but like the other ages, it's got an upside and a downside, a light side and a dark side. So looking at it from the admittedly narrow point of view of an academic, yes, I do see certain advantages. when I started my career, it would have been unthinkable, unimaginable, this communication with colleagues at the other end of the world by email, where you can have what's very much like a conversation, because you write something and 5 minutes later the answer comes back, and then you reply to that answer, and so on. When you're trying to organize a book with collective authorship, it's wonderful to be able to do things like this. And thinking of people who didn't have access to great libraries. I never had this experience myself, having spent most of my life in Oxford, Cambridge, London, always able to go to a major world library if I needed something. But now so much of what's in those libraries is available to people who just need to have a PC and Wi-Fi working, even contents of archives. A friend, a colleague who works on Spanish history in the 16th century, and he's finding it difficult to move now, going all the way from the United States, where he teaches, to the big archive in Simancas is more of a problem. But he can call up on his screen so many unpublished documents and analyze them and write his books. So there is definitely an upside. The downside is, are we losing some traditional skills that we once had? And I think this is connected to the idea of a crisis of knowledge in our time. But I think you want to ask me about that separately.
I do, thank you so much. Yeah, so you have a coda towards the end of the book about a third crisis, you call it, and it relates to the age that we're in now, the digital age or the information age. What are your thoughts? I mean, you've already begun this discussion, but any other thoughts on the digital age or the information age and how we could address this crisis as a society?
So, as you might expect, I see this age as an age of both new problems and new solutions. Actually, when I hear the word crisis, I always draw back a little bit, because I think people, and I mean especially journalists and historians, tend to use the word much too easily. And I think if you talk about a crisis in a particular period of world history, you ought to be able to point to an age of non-crisis to contrast it with, and this isn't at all easy. So I want to say something about new problems and possible new solutions. And because it's a huge subject, and I want to be relatively brief, I'm going to pick two particular problems of the digital age. And so the first being the one that the information flow has accelerated to a tremendous and even alarming degree, because it doesn't allow people the time to digest that information and turn it into knowledge. You see, I'm operating with a simple model in which what I call information is relatively raw, not completely, and knowledge has been processed. I like to say sometimes it's been cooked. I mean, for example, that this information has been verified, it's been classified, it's been analyzed. And all this takes quite a bit of time. And at the speed with which information is coming in, even specialized institutions are struggling to keep up. Now, there's a possible solution, and that is you have to enlist the machines on your side. They're part of the problem, but they could be part of the solution. And so it is possible to use computers to analyze big data, as they call it. I'm not sure whether they can go through all the steps of analysis, but at the very least, it seems that the computers are able to select. So they provide you with the information that's relevant to a particular problem, when otherwise you'd be struggling in a whole sea of information. I'm not only thinking about universities, I'm thinking about, let's say, the CIA, and I'm thinking of the of 9/11 and the American government's reaction and to the news that warnings of what was going to happen had actually been sent. And the Secretary of State, that must have been Condoleezza Rice, she just said there was a lot of chatter in the system. In other words, so much was coming in that people didn't have a way of finding what was relevant, which would have led to very different action. So it is a big problem, and there may be a solution. This is really well outside my competence to know exactly what kinds of analysis the computer is capable of now, and let alone what it might be capable of in the future. So I go to a second big problem, and which, as I'm a semi-optimist, I think there is a possible solution. And the problem is whether we're losing the art of reading. That is, as all of us, and maybe a younger generation, even more than an older one, are spending so much of the time that they spend reading texts. They read them online. And in fact, it isn't so much reading, it's scanning. In search of particular information, you're surfing the internet, you're skipping a lot of what you see, trying to isolate what is particularly relevant to you at a particular moment. That's fine in itself, but the question is whether this has some effect on whether your reading skills in general. I met a journalist at a conference who was very eloquent about this, because he loved reading books, but he found that after 20 years of working online, he was finding it very hard to read a book from the beginning to end. He didn't have his attention wasn't caught, and he started to read neuroscience, and he thought that this is maybe just as new connections between neurons are made when people are surfing online. But the neurons are too flexible, they're too plastic. So they move away from, and you start to lose an earlier skill because you're not practicing it enough. I still read so many books and ration my online scanning. I don't feel it personally, but I think that for students, this is for the future of today's students, this is a problem. But once again, I'm at least semi-optimistic, because I suddenly thought this is actually the exact opposite of a problem that I encountered when I began to teach at university. And I had a lot of bright 18-year-olds who were very good at reading a book from start to finish, or an article in that way, but they weren't very good at selecting information quickly which was relevant to their weekly essay. And in those days, this was recognized as a problem, and there were so-called speed reading courses that would help the students develop this particular skill. So today, I think we need the opposite, slow reading courses. Slow reading, like slow eating and slow cinema and all the other slow movements that have developed in reaction against doing things too fast. So if we can teach speed reading, you can maybe help people recover the art, not completely lost, because we need both. Sometimes we need information in a hurry. Sometimes we need to really meditate on a book or give ourselves up to it. One mustn't be, active reading is good in some contexts, but we mustn't forget the art of passive reading. You're really giving yourself up to this novel. You let yourself flow with the author in the way that they want rather than the way that you want. And so in that way, I think that the most serious problems, there is a possible solution to them. Of course, I also believe, maybe this sounds more cynical, that every solution to a problem, sooner or later, whether you like it or not, will produce a problem of its own. But then again, that problem will produce a solution, and so we go on.
Life is complicated. Thank you so much for that. And another question of Patrick's, I'll read out now. So Patrick was wondering, does the digital era, in your view, inhibit or enable wide-ranging experimentation in disparate fields, which are key to Polymath's experience or methodology in previous eras? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, predictably, I'm going to say that I believe it does both. On one side, it inhibits because it distracts. There are all these mysterious or exciting things happening online. And once you switch on and you get started on one thing, it leads to something else and something else. Whereas some of the time we need just to sit down with a single problem and focus on it. But at the same time, when you are trying to find something out for a specific purpose, then you can work faster than you otherwise were able to do. You don't even have to walk to the library if it's in your city, or take the train to the library if it's somewhere else. And you look up, I think I have no guilt feelings about using Wikipedia at the first stage, though, and I do like it partly because of the intellectual health warnings that it displays about itself, you know, that this article may be biased, this article needs more sources. You never got that when you took down a volume of the Encyclopedia Britannica. There was nothing they could do about that, I suppose. So all that's to the good, but I tend to focus, I suppose because I had a historian's training, focus on the notes and the bibliography. And so then I'll look something up, which is also available online, to check whether the statements in the first article are true. And then, of course, that can lead me to something else. It's the usual historian's process of going back to the sources. It's just that you can do it so much faster and even in the comfort of your swivel chair rather than in the old way of putting down the book and going somewhere, pulling another volume off the shelf and trying to find the right page and all those things. I hope that's satisfying.
I think Patrick would be delighted with that. I thought it was a very interesting answer. Thank you so much. Professor Burke, can you see the Q&A tab there? There are a few questions in the questions and answers tab. Can you see those? So the first question from Robert Bornholtz, if I read that out, is that visible to you? Don't worry if it's not. Don't worry if it's not.
Should I click Q&A?
Yeah, click on Q&A. Yeah, with the red notification. So click on that and it'll come up in front of you. There.
Okay, and shall I read it out?
Well, I'll read it out. Might be easy.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. So Robert is wondering, can Polymaths help society to get more agreement on normative truth to bridge polarization into factions that live in their own worlds? So do you think that there's a benefit to having Polymaths in terms of, I suppose, mediation and understanding different fields and different worlds and bringing people together?
Well, my first reaction is, isn't that what philosophers are supposed to be doing? and then I wonder, have polymaths got a special contribution to make? Of course, it's interesting. Philosophy is a much more complex discipline than it used to be as a result of the trend to specialization. At one time, philosophers say something about everything, and then they decide to specialize in moral philosophy or say the philosophy of science. I caught up with that when I met somebody who said he was a philosopher of biology. And so philosophy of science is too big a field, and so you choose a particular part of it. And there are philosophers of physics and so on. But I think, let's say, a bunch of philosophers with different specializations might be a better choice to get this agreement on normative truth than the rest of us who are pursuing knowledge in particular fields without thinking about that general problem so much of the time.
Thank you so much. So another point in the Q&A, which is not a question, but just a remark that's from Donald. That's my father. He's probably a polymath by your definition. So he says a note on the word interdiscipline. It goes back to the Journal of General Education, volumes 6 and 7. I'll send you the citation for that if it's of interest. Thanks, Dad. From Michael O'Shukru, if you can see down below in the Q&A there, Professor Burke. So Michael asks, despite your optimism, is the thesis that increased information is leading to a decline in knowledge a polite way of saying we are becoming more stupid, which an hour on social media would seem to confirm. So what are your thoughts on our generation who use social media? And in terms of a decline in knowledge, is that negative? Is it a polite way of saying that we're becoming more stupid?
Yes, I didn't know about the word interdiscipline. The adjective interdisciplinary and the noun interdisciplinarity were being used quite a lot at universities in the early 60s, because since I was around then and at a university then, I can testify to the fact that this was starting. I noticed it at Oxford before I saw the advertisement that jobs were going at the University of Sussex, and it had the word interdisciplinarity in it. And so I immediately wrote a letter applying for a job, although I was not quite halfway through my doctoral dissertation in Oxford. But then I got the job, and so I never finished the doctorate.
Thank you so much. One last question from Stuart Kinsella. You mentioned eccentricities and absent-mindedness, but is there evidence for polymaths being on the autistic spectrum that might account for their extraordinary abilities?
Yes, I can't comment on social media because I don't use it. Okay. I haven't, but I don't think increased information is leading to an actual decline in knowledge. I think increased information is delaying the transformation of information into knowledge, which is not quite the same thing. So you sound as if you're a lot more pessimistic than I am.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you wanted to bring in, Professor Burke, that we haven't touched on? We still have a few minutes, but just in case there's anything that we haven't addressed that you'd like to talk about.
I think one could go in all sorts of directions at this point, but no, there isn't one point that I made in the book, which I'm sorry that hasn't come up. No, I think our conversation has given listeners, I think, a pretty good idea of what I was trying to do and what's covered and what's not covered.
It's been very interesting for us, and it's so relevant at this time. Obviously, we're in a university context, but also this push towards interdisciplinarity. It does continue in Trinity, and we see, when I was an undergraduate, it was possible to study law and a language, but nowadays it's possible to study law and business, law and political science, and then there are plans being drawn up potentially for law and history, which I was speaking to Dr. Houlihan about recently. So I think this is very topical for the people listening and the broader university. So I will circulate this afterwards. I think it will be very, very much valued. So thank you. So I just wanted to thank you so much again for all of your insights, and to everybody for attending. And thanks also to Patrick for co-hosting. It's been really a wonderful experience. Professor Burke, you're an influential thinker and a prolific scholar, and the book touches on important issues relating to learning and knowledge in our modern world. So I'd like to express my sincere and utmost gratitude to you for sharing these really valuable insights with the college community and beyond, and for writing about these important topics. And we look forward to your upcoming publication on the social history of ignorance. I think it will be interesting to have another webinar on the publication of that piece. So we look forward to that. So with that, unless there's anything else you'd like to add, I close the session. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Take care. Thanks.